When the first white men in Montreal built their canoes and put those canoes in the water and headed west on the Great Lakes toward Wisconsin, they weren't looking for a good place to get furs. Instead, they were seeking a waterway across the continent. 15 years after the Pilgrims arrived, Jean Nicolet put his canoe ashore on what would later become Green Bay. Actually, the fur trading business began very slowly in our state. We believe that the first to gather hides from the Indians in our state were Radisson and Grossier. They did this for a period of 2 years in the northern part of the state. The story of fur trading is well explained today by volunteers at Prairie du Chien, a major fur post on the Wisconsin shores of the Mississippi.
At that time, everyone in Europe was wearing a beaver felt hat if they were a diplomat or a nobleman. The beaver felt hat cost $300, and that was what your workman weighed and made in a year of work, $300. So you know it wasn't any of the workmen wearing a beaver felt hat. You know it would have been a nobleman. Now what you see out there is a fur press. Out there in front of the restrooms, fur press. At that time it was in the basement. Now the Indians unloaded their furs into the basement here, and 2 men worked on the fur press. They would make them into 90-pound bales and tie them. Then this hook was let down through a hole in the floor, and this rope went up over a big wheel up there that you can see. Then they would haul it to the attic. The reason for that is we had lots of floods at that time, and had it been left in the basement, it might have gotten wet and they would have rotted. We lost lots of furs as it was. When they got to Europe, oftentimes they were called soft gold because so much of them had rotted on the way over there.
More about Prairie du Chien later. Though it's believed that Radisson and Grossier built a fur post on Chequamegon Bay, though the remains of that building have never been found, if true, this is the first building in western Lake Superior erected by white men, and of course, the first fur post in Wisconsin. The trade goods the strangers brought to Indian Territory fascinated the native people. They couldn't understand how the Europeans made such things as metal spear points, cooking kettles, axes, wool blankets, and so on. And they were surprised that the whites wanted something as common to them as furs in exchange for trade items. They also developed a close friendship with the French. The same attitude would not apply later to the British or to the Americans. For the Indians of Wisconsin, their way of life had begun to change and would never again be the same. They quit making tools of stone, wood, and bone. They gave up wearing furs if they could buy material from trading posts. Some of these things made their lives easier, but with them they also got diseases from the Europeans, and just as serious, they were exposed to liquor. The little fur post on the mainland at Chequamegon Bay was no longer safe for the whites when the war broke out between the Chippewa and the Sioux. So its new operator, Pierre Le Sueur, moved the post out to Madeline Island, the largest of the Apostle group. The island was well populated with Chippewas. By the 1700s, the British began to open their own fur posts here, knowing it was becoming a well-paying business for the French. The traders got their supplies from the French and British governments. The governments kept close control over the furs, which they bought from the traders. No private trading with the Indians was legal. Even though it was illegal and punishable with prison terms, some of the French and the English did it secretly. They went to live in the remote forests. Often they married Indian women, and they carried on their own trading. Charles Langlade, a Frenchman, opened a fur post in Green Bay with his father, Augustin, in 1745. His operation was legal, however. At that time, there were still only 7 or 8 non-Indian families living in Green Bay, but the city's first business was underway. Those few families lived inside the walls of a small fort on the Fox River. They seldom saw any other white people because the nearest town was 240 miles away on Mackinac Island to the east. There was no school here, there was no church, no doctor, not even a road. For some, it must have been a very lonely life indeed. They had to rely on canoes for travel, but this could be done only when the water was not frozen on the river or the lake. In the winter, they could go only short distances in what was called a French train, a long box dragged along in the snow by two horses. The canoe then was of little value. Some of the whites, especially the women, were in fear of Indians who lived outside the fort. Charlotte Langlade, wife of the post commander, was one of those who was afraid of the Chippewas. When she saw them, she sometimes screamed, "They're coming, and we'll all be killed." One day when Indians were doing their trading business at the post, she grabbed one surprised brave by the neck and cried out, "You are a dead man." Everybody, including the Indians, simply laughed at her and sent her on her way. Before long, everyone quit being afraid. They realized that the Chippewas were not going to harm them. They began to plant gardens, using the French system of laying out the gardens in a long, narrow strip along the river outside the fort. Green Bay's growth was along the banks of the Fox River. The Winnebagoes were not as kind or friendly to the French when the traders wanted to build a post at nearby Fond du Lac. The Winnebagoes tried to kill or drive off all the traders who wanted to live near them. Two men from Green Bay's post, Jacques Prairie and John Law, were able to make peace with the Winnebagoes, and they moved the Fond du Lac post to a safer place on Lake Winnebago. Here things were a lot more peaceful. Problems among the French and the British did not disappear, however. They were always disagreeing. Sometimes their anger caused violence. Each wanted the other's trade areas. As the British moved farther west on the Great Lakes, they took over the Lake Superior fur trade business. Fort La Pointe was burned by British soldiers, who then put up their own post on Madeline Island. Madeline Island became a center of operations on western Lake Superior. The Americans later took control of the island when our biggest fur trader, John Jacob Astor, ran a post there. British soldiers went after the French post at Green Bay, tore it down, and built their own new post. But the French were allowed to stay there with the new English residents. They got along fairly well. Record books were kept to show what each Indian bought at this post. He was allowed to get supplies with a kind of a charge account. In the spring, he would bring in his furs and pay up his bill. The axe heads were especially valued by the Indians, and none of them was given away. They had to be bought with furs. One hide was worth one axe head. If they had nothing at all to trade, the Indian then did not get a tool. Over time, the whites and the Indians got along even better. Some of the traders fed the Indians during hard winters or other bad times, and they gave the needy Indians free clothing. They also helped the native people learn new skills, but the Indians, in turn, taught the whites even more, knowledge that helped the Europeans live better in the wilderness. The traders paid the Indians to carry the canoes over the portages from one waterway to another. This was especially true where the Fox and Wisconsin rivers meet, the location of the city of Portage today. A man named Laurent Barth and his family started the town that was later to be named Fort Winnebago. Barth feared Indians might stop the British fur movement, so he took control of the portage routes wherever possible. Today's city of Prairie du Chien has its roots deep in the fur trading business, and there are remains of that colorful past still to be seen there today, including the stone building used by fur trader Michael Brisbois, and his home is there as well. On the prairie flatland, the traders met with Indians who had furs to trade. Even before the French came in 1727, this was a great meeting place every fall and spring for thousands of Indians from various tribes. They met to talk about the fur trading with the whites who were at that time still far to the east. Most of the people living here at that time in the early 1700s were Indians. There were only about 50 white men, most of them married Indian women. This meant the white women numbered only about 10, but there was peace among all, at least until the British arrived during the American Revolutionary War. The French then decided it was time to quit. They gave up 100 years of running Wisconsin's fur trade business. Buffalo herds were one of the only problems the French reported in those peaceful times. It seems that thousands of them moved across the grasslands around Prairie du Chien, at times crowding the river at shallow crossing spots so badly the canoes could not even get through. The British and the Americans got into a battle at Prairie du Chien. Robert Dixon gave British supplies to the Indians, who then attacked American stores and settlements. In 1812, the Americans again fought the British, who came back to Prairie du Chien with 150 soldiers and 400 Indians fighting with them. They sent a note to the Americans to give up. The Americans simply said no. But the British captured Fort Shelby at Prairie du Chien, sent the Americans down the Mississippi on boats, and named Fort Shelby Fort McKay. The Indians later became unhappy with their British friends, who said they killed too many people and took too much game. They became very angry and wanted to fight the British. But when they learned the English and the Americans had signed a peace treaty, they decided not to fight. Instead, they burned Fort McKay. With the Americans now in charge of fur trade, they built Fort Crawford. Here you can see only the remains of the outlines of the buildings. This too is at Prairie du Chien. Fort Howard was built at Green Bay, and Fort Winnebago at Portage. Probably the richest Wisconsin fur trader was Hercules Dousman, who built this elegant home with his profits. It's open to the general public in Prairie du Chien. And here, the story of Dousman's business and his private life can be learned on one of the tours of this very lovely home. A place so modern for its time, it even had a kind of air conditioning to cool the rooms with such luxury, and it wasn't even available at that time in Washington, D.C. A flow of air over the ice harvested from the Mississippi during the winter was the method used. Dousman had control of the fur trade up and down the Mississippi, from Iowa all the way up into Minnesota. No wonder he could afford this kind of luxury. Few animals escape being trapped for the fur industry. The museum near Dousman's home has a display of the beaver hats, which were the most popular in Europe, and the main use for Dousman's furs. The guide explains.
The different styles of the beaver felt hat: the continental, the clerical, the Paris bow, the Wellington, the Regent, and the D'Orsay. And here's our gentleman of the 1790 with his beaver felt hat and his beaver muff. Now, beaver is a little heavier quality food or fur than the other. Mink is very light, so our ladies of 1816, 1810 had mink as a trim.
Where the fur-bearing animals are concerned, the end of the fur business came none too soon. Their kind became very scarce, and in some cases, they've never returned to anything near what they once were in numbers. They simply don't have the large wilderness areas in which to live, and they never will again. In time, fur posts were replaced by farms as settlers moved into Wisconsin in large numbers, attracted by true reports of good soil and free or very cheap land. Now, there was a new kind of fur bearer, a tame one. The 200 years of fur trading became only a part of our history. Sons and daughters of some of those early French, English, and American traders are still living in Wisconsin, as are those of the Chippewas, the Winnebagos, and other Indian tribal members who were equally important in the story of Wisconsin's fur posts.